So, hello everybody, and welcome to the live question and answer session of session 7. This is day 2 of the EXARC conference 2021. We have our speakers here all anxiously awaiting your questions, and I see there's a lovely amount already. We have our first question for Peter here. At the open-air museums, how much interaction do you allow your visitors to have with the houses? For example, can children climb on the houses? Can people go in them and on them, etc.? How much interaction is allowed?
That's a great question. So the house structures were built just before lockdown. So the answer is, to some degree, we're not quite sure. They're built as part of a research project, though, and so at the moment we have them relatively separate from. They're sort of within a fenced enclosure. But I think in the longer term, it would be really nice to have sort of structures at the site which would allow people to really engage with. It's a site which is part of the university's botanical garden, so it's accessed by quite a large number of public visitors. And over the time I've spent there over the last few weeks, you see quite a lot of people sort of having a little look around and nose into the structures. The hut is currently quite well occupied by mice. So that usually puts off most visitors at the moment. But yeah, I think it'd be great to have more interaction.
Okay, great, thank you. I actually have another question for you, asking what is your henge based on? Did the builders receive any inspiration while building it of what the purpose might have been of the original?
That's a great question. Now, you'd think I would know the answer to that. As I understand, it was built in 2008. And there is some information about it online. It was built by a former student of Liverpool University, whose name is John, but I've forgotten his second name. There is more information about it online. There's actually a really nice post, which is really nice sort of discussion of the henge itself and a sort of visit to it in its space. So it's really nice to see people exploring it as a monument. It's a 1/3 replica of the size, and so it's not quite full size, but it's a really interesting layout, and it's aligned on a number of features within the landscape, as well as the astronomical alignments that were sort of being explored by the experimental research.
Thank you. I have a question here for Sally. What kind of leather, so the animal, is the original Clonbrin shield made from?
As far as I know, they're not quite sure what the original Clonbrin shield's made of, because it's spent so long in the peat bog. Being able to tell exactly what it is quite difficult. But I can certainly double check on the sort of original documents. So if the person who's posted that would like to contact me, I can have a look on my research stuff and have a chat with them later.
Perfect, that sounds good. Actually, we have another question for you about the shield. Would it be possible to heat the leather in place on the mould rather than preheating it?
Right, so the material I'm using is not leather. It's not been tanned at all. What I do is I take the green cow skin, so that's a fresh cow skin, take the hair off of it, take the fat off of the inside, and then I stretch that piece of skin out over and heat that over the fire, and then I put it in the mould. I think to heat it on the mould, you effectively could do it if you blowtorched it, sort of thing, but then you have the chance, obviously, of burning the skin. I'm using the radiated heat generated from the hot stones rather than a flame to heat the skin. Does that answer the question?
Yes, no, I think so. I suppose they were wondering why, whether you could skip the middle step, so to speak. So rather than stretching it out and then applying it, just having it on there and shrinking it in place.
Oh yes, I see what you mean. So the piece of skin is put into the mould outside of the skin, the grain side down, and that's how you create the shape. To heat it, you'd have to hold the whole lot upside down effectively over the fire, which would make it really, really difficult, because you'd have no way of holding the skin over the heat, if you see what I mean. Yes, so I don't think that would be very easy at all. So
our next question is for Nicola. You focused on the casting aspect of your research in the video, but maybe you could give a little taster of the second part of your experiments, looking at silvering technologies. And also, are you planning any further experiments with minting?
Okay. So yeah, the silvering technology was actually the main bulk of my experiments and the main purpose of the thesis, but I couldn't include them in the talk because it was just too much information. I will be releasing a publication about the silvering experiments later this year, so keep an eye out for that. But basically, in the period I'm looking at, the Roman moneyers were artificially enhancing the coins by a process of surface enrichment, and we know this process quite well and how it works. But at the later end of the period, so about AD 270. There was no longer enough silver in the blanks to create the silvered surface created by enrichment. So they had to change and create a new silvering technology, but we don't actually know, well, we didn't know before what that was. So my experiments tested a number of different methods that have been suggested for ancient silvering. And I actually found that they were directly enriching the surfaces of the coins by adding silver tin and lead to the alloy and then heating it up, and that would force the silver and lead to the surface, and then it would plate the coins from the inside.
Perfect. Oh, thank you. I have another question for you, actually, meant about the powdered charcoal and the fact that it didn't work as well as you were hoping. So what was your original reasoning for using the powdered charcoal?
Just from previous literature, and then speaking to people in the department, it was just suggested that would be a good way to go. Obviously, thinking about it, the consistency was just not right. So after reflection, switching to something that just had spreadability really and could coat the molds properly really made a huge difference.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We have another question here for Carina/Janica. Thank you for your talk. Interested in many details, which may be in the paper. You prepared 100 kilos of ore, but only added 7 kilos to the smelt. In my experience, this only just starts to establish a working slag bowl system. Why did you decide for such a small amount?
We wanted to, we did only one run with the furnace, and then we have only used 7 kilos in total. So we are planning for more experiments.
Okay, yes, makes sense. Pre-collect all the material, save it for a rainy day. Yes, fair enough.
In the beginning, we didn't know how much it would lose weight before the roasting. So that's why we took up so much ore from the sea bottom.
Okay. Do you think that this might have been something that happened in the past as well? Or do you think that people would have known how much to use, so would only have collected what they needed?
Oh, that's
difficult to say.
During excavations, we found 2 furnaces and they have been used multiple times. And we found also ore next to the furnaces. So, and different kinds of ores, lake ores and ores from mires. So maybe they have mixed different ores to get a composition that is suited for the iron they wanted to produce. We don't know yet. We are still doing analysis of the material.
Okay, great. Okay, our next question is for Elizabeth. How much contamination is on the objects, for example, from museum conservation, etc.? And how does this affect identification of what elements are present in the raw material?
In terms of contamination, it's more that they've stripped away a lot of the corrosion from some conservation. So they've removed the green stuff and the mirror's gone shiny again, which unfortunately that actually removes the original surface of the mirror. So then the metal that I actually analyze is the bulk metal. It's like in the middle of the mirror essentially, which can be an issue because there was possible surface enrichment where the surface of the mirror would have been a different composition and then a different color to the actual bulk metal I'm analyzing.
Okay, that's interesting. Out of curiosity, are you planning as well to do experiments in terms of replicating the mirrors as well?
Yes, so the methodology was from my master's, and I've just started my PhD, and that is a big part of my PhD in trying to recreate a number of arsenical coppers, looking at the different microstructures and how they were manufactured.
Next question is for Stacey. If they had to give up their wings before entering the camp, how do you think they made the molds if they didn't have, I guess, the original to press in?
Yeah, so in some cases there was definitely people carving them. So I didn't have room to include all the different wings I looked at in the presentation, but I do have examples of some that were made from wood. So we have wooden wings there, which could then be used to create the master copy. There was also a possibility they could have carved soap, or they could have used beeswax, which some of them had access to if they were using a lost wax method. There was also people that did retain their wings, so not everybody got rid of them, but quite a few people had to for the various reasons discussed.
Great, thank you. So that also might be a future thing, also trying some wood carving, or will you stick with using existing wings?
Oh, definitely. I'd like to look into different options. I did attempt to do some soap carving, but sadly didn't get very far with that. So I think that's something that I'd like to look into further and explore a bit more.
Question for Jake here. You talked about the need to look at these molds as separate objects in their own right. Do you think that they would have been made by the same people minting the coins, or in the same context, or as part of a completely separate process?
So that's actually a really interesting question, and discussions around this material are starting to kind of encroach on that topic, because when you see an artifact like a pellet mold, and if they're making pellets, that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire, if it is for coinage, that entire process is happening on that one site. And we do have assemblages of coin mold that are found on sites where you don't typically, it's a small site and it doesn't have any other indicators that it might be a mint, and in the past, sometimes just the presence of this material, these pellet molds, is used as the identifier of that site being a mint, which might not necessarily be correct. So there's actually a lot to take apart in that, and if you consider the entire process from the raw material all the way to the finished product, there's so many individual processes, and that the material goes through, and not all of that happens in one place. It doesn't have to happen in one place. It's all about the bigger network that it plays a part in.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. That relates a little bit to another question that is aimed at Nicola, but you might both want to say something about this, because you mentioned the minting machinery was movable. So could this have meant that there was also not a central location for minting, but that there would have been traveling minters, or sort of like traveling carpenters?
We obviously, they had the mints in the cities that were not temporary structures. However, a lot of the Roman silver went to the army. So to keep them happy, they had to have the coins movable structures that they could take with the army so they could pay them. So the movable structures, everything should be able to be created, as they are traveling around. Does that answer the question?
Yes, no, definitely. I don't know, Jake, if you have anything to add. Yeah.
I think the same concept of like mobile minting, as it were, has been thrown around in the late Iron Age period as well, and I think it's more of a question that's probably best suited to someone more familiar with maybe the iconography of the coinages, a numismatist, because you can track the art styles across different issues, and you could maybe look at that in terms of mobile minting. Maybe the person that creates those designs is moving as part of a group or transferring from site to site. It's not necessarily something that I could look closely with the material that I focus on, but it definitely is a concept and a pathway that should be looked into further, if you want to kind of produce this big picture of what coin minting really looked like.
Thanks. And like you say, I guess it's interesting that certain artifacts are considered diagnostics of certain site types, but actually that might not be the case at all in this case. We have a question here for Peter. What is generally the background of your students? As you offer so many scientific analysis opportunities, do you have more students coming from scientifically focused backgrounds than archaeological backgrounds?
That's a good question. I don't get the impression that that's the case, and from my perspective, it's much more important for archaeologists to be kind of engaged in scientific methods and scientific sort of research and understand the way in which that can really benefit their own research to answer archaeological questions than be to really kind of sort of proficient scientists from the beginning. I think that's something which comes with experience. So I think that a lot of our students have come from a very wide range of different backgrounds. Some are more interested in science than others, but a lot of students will pick up an interest in science during the course of their studies, which I hope they will.
Okay, we have another question here for Carina/Janica. If the local clay was not good enough for building the furnace, where do you think they would have got the clay from? Because it's interesting that they used local ore, but would have maybe imported clay. Do you think another material or method of smelting might be possible?
Well, we did a survey of the clay in the local surroundings, and we found clay approximately 15 kilometers away that was suited for the smelting and had enough refractory qualities and could withstand the high temperatures. But we couldn't collect that clay and bring it to the experiment. So we had to use modern clay. So there is suitable clays, but they are approximately 15 kilometers away. So it seems like they have located the iron production close to the iron ores, and they have gone a further bit to collect the clay. So, but the most important seems to be a closeness to the local ores.
I see that there is a question for Stacey. Is this kind of metalworking amongst prisoner of wars something that is common across the prisoner of war experience in different armed forces in World War II?
This is a really interesting question. So in my initial grouping, the majority of them were wings. However, I did have one insignia, which was the long-range desert group. They had done a direct copy of an insignia. However, they riffed on it a little bit, so that one was more possibly carved and done from memory. There's also some writing about people creating arm bars out of tin. However, I would hypothesize that maybe because if someone just found some little strips of tin in the ground at one of the sites, they probably wouldn't necessarily connect that might be something to do with insignia. It's something I'd like to look into more, but I haven't found a huge amount of evidence around that yet.
Great, okay, thank you. I actually have another question for you here. Is it possible to look at the wings and link them directly to an individual? So to think how they might be using the unique skills that they have to produce effectively the same object. So a person whose hobby is wood carving chooses wood and so forth.
So some of the people actually wrote their names on the back of the wings, which has been particularly helpful when trying to trace them. However, it still doesn't quite tell me who was actually making them. I have a few accounts, as I talked about in the video, where it's people discussing that they were making them. And I think it would be really interesting to try and trace back a little bit more, see if I can find exactly who was doing it and see if I can find out a bit more about their background as well.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question for Lara. If things were to proceed ideally in your perspective, how might an individual conduct experimental archaeology ethically, especially in countries or contexts where there are ethical dilemmas, and how might an organization do so?
Well, thank you for this wonderful question, and thank you to all the organizers of the conference, by the way. And sorry if I take advantage of this moment that I'm speaking. I would like to remember John Coles before going on with the question. And it is a very interesting question. It is crucial that every ethical dilemma that we meet not only in experimental archaeology, you know, that's the real point of my presentation, but in how we conduct both our research and our, for example, behavior with our co-workers and how we approach our communication to the public. It's like an overarching issue. So I think, you know, the most important thing would be to start from ourselves, you know, develop some sort of reflexivity and understand that the healthy part of our relationship is basically meeting halfway with the other, you know. So whatever this other is a major ethical issue like that, I don't know, it involves, for example, parts of society who are struggling with it, or a plant or an animal, you know, or other things, or our peers. We really need to ask the ethical question first. I hope that I kind of replied.
No, that sounds like a good one. We have a other related question, actually. What advice would you give to those experimental archaeologists who are not affiliated with an institution in terms of how to proceed ethically, who might not have the structure in place, shall we say?
Well, I would actually, everything is listed in the description of the video. So I would suggest start with the Singapore statement. This is why I chose this initial, that's just the beginning, you know, of all the issues that are there. But that's a good start. I mean, if all the scholars have agreed on those principles and responsibilities, I don't see why someone else who's not into an institution should not use them.
Okay, no, good point, I think. So yes, if anyone wants to check on that, all of the links are underneath the video, which can be found in the Session 7 playlist on YouTube, on the EXARC YouTube channel. So do go and check that out. We have a question for Jake. Do you think that people in the past would also have been noting the temperatures and the weights with such precision? Or, for example, as you continued with experiments, did you recognize more qualitative ways to measure the different steps in the manufacturing process?
So, yeah, I guess it's all about your skill and perception. I think, you know, from a modern perspective, it can be quite hard, you know, with all of our technological advances and our reliance on the internet and stuff for our information. It can be quite hard sometimes to think that people who don't have access to that actually learn to, you know, their observation skills are so much greater. And, you know, if you've been working with pyrotechnology for many years, you will develop those, kind of naturally develop those skills to be able to tell when something is right, you know, when the fire needs more fuel, when it's at the temperature that you want it to be. And in terms of weight, you know, obviously in my experiment I used electronic mechanical weighing system to get precise weights, but you know, it's quite arbitrary in terms of relating back to the past. And back then they could have easily had something that was of a standardized weight that they used, perhaps, and you know, it could have been anything, a small metal cube, you know, it could have been anything, but they could use that easily to weigh, maybe not to the same precision that we can weigh here in the future, but as I've said in the presentation, you know, the weight differences are negligible, really, and the weights that we focus on now might not have really been too much bother back then. You know, if you look at the weights of coins across certain series, you know, there is variation in their weights, but generally it keeps to a tight group. So yeah, I think it's all about, you know, observation and skill.
On that topic, did you ask at all, not ask, but sort of, yeah, ask for assistance or for experience from current, like modern coin?
So part of my research is the fact that, you know, and part of the arguments that crop up in more recent discussions regarding this material is whether or not you can actually say that this material links explicitly to coinage. You know, there are a lot of, from the earliest publications of this material, that link was made and it's persisted. And so when you're considering it with all of the kind of analytical techniques available to us and the wealth of research that we have to delve into, to say that they're linked to coinage is a bit, without the data to back it, can be a bit treacherous. So I'm choosing to focus specifically on this material and reconstruct the alloys from them before I start linking it to coinages. So as I say, I think to answer the question, I'm at the moment, I'm veering, staying away from coinage slightly, just to get the groundwork done on these actual artifacts, so that then they have a strong foundation with which we can start beginning to link to certain artifact series.
Okay, great, thanks. I actually, while you're still here, I have a quick follow-up question to an earlier point you made. So metals were granulated first separately, then melted to pellets in the molds?
Yes. So there are, I do know that in other experiments that have been done, alloys may have been, the metals may have been pre-alloyed before being granulated up. It's definitely something that needs a lot more research and consideration, because in terms of like what I've seen in archaeological material, when you're looking at just the minute residues, it can be really difficult to tell whether you're looking at a residue from an alloyed metal or residues from the separate components. And that's why the experimental data is so important, because it can help us build models to kind of pick those residues apart and reconstruct them properly.
Okay, great, thank you. And while we're on the subject of minting, I have another question for Nicola. The clay molds were impractical and the bronze can be recycled, but what might account for the lack of the limestone molds in the archaeological record? And then there's a second part. Were there any coins with surface depletion that you looked at, and have you experimented using acid on coin?
Yeah, so with whichever molds they were using, the secrecy exercise that the Roman mints to ensure that molds and all the materials didn't fall into the hands of counterfeiters means they would have destroyed whatever material to prevent it from being reused. So even with limestone, I guess they would have broken it down and destroyed it. But like I said, none have been found in the archaeological record. And then what was the second half of that question? Sorry.
The second was about, were there any coins with surface depletion that you looked at, and have you experimented using acid on coins?
Okay, yeah, so like I said, one of the main aspects of my experimental work was looking at the silvering techniques, and we know that in the period I looked at, surface depletion was the main manner that they enriched the surfaces of their coins up to around AD 260, when there was not enough silver in the alloy composition to create a silvered surface through depletion silvering. So yeah, I created coins of all different compositions, and then I tested 4 different recipes of acids, which again is going to be in the publication. Actually, no, if you check out the debasement volume of Kevin Butcher, there's a paper in there with the different recipes that I used. I did test different acids. I tried lemon juice, vinegar, and then I tried plum juice as well. And then I also tried 2 recipes with ferric sulfite in, because I had actually read in different papers that could have been used. But all the details, again, are in that publication with Kevin Butcher's.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I have a question for Francesca. Our pottery people are waking up gradually. So you mentioned creating the kiln floor as segments to avoid splitting and being forced to recreate the whole floor. Is this approach based on known examples? Kiln floors above the firebox like this seem to often be built in situ. So would you explore the possibility of creating it in situ in future work?
Probably yes. Well, now we try this way because there are some archaeological evidence of splitting the platform in several parts, and also because it's more handy to do it in this way for the moment. But why not? If there will be another opportunity to build and create another kiln, we may try to do in this way. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I have another one for you here, actually. So what other changes would you make to this experiment if you were able to run it again? What results were most surprising for you in this present experiment?
Well, at the moment, we still have to fire the kiln, actually, because we had for the COVID restrictions, we couldn't go on and fire it last year. So hopefully we can do it this summer with with less traveling restrictions, because at the moment I am in Italy. And well, so first we have to see what will happen, the results of this experiment that we are doing. And well, we are looking forward to see if the perforated floor works well, and what's the reaction of the clay that we use to make the pots in these during the firing, and what will be the fuel consumption to fire our pots, etc. So we'll see.
We would probably experiment with more sigillata formulas to improve black gloss production.
We have another question for Elizabeth. You mentioned the quite high arsenic content. Is there any kind of evidence, ancient or indeed from later periods, for adverse effects of this level of arsenic content in metal objects?
A number of people have looked into the properties of arsenic and how it changes copper. With high arsenic, it increases the hardness of the metal, but also makes it really brittle. So when you work it, it will crack quite easily, as I've experienced trying to work some of my experimental stuff, which you don't want a mirror to crack, but you do want it to be quite hard for a polish, because the harder the metal, the better the polish, and in turn, the better the reflection will be. So it's kind of, you need to get the balance right. And high arsenic also impacts the color of the metal. So the more arsenic, the more like silver the metal becomes. So it changes the appearance of the mirror and then how the reflection would look as well.
Great, thank you. Out of curiosity, would you, because you said you were hoping to do some experiments with making them, I suppose you wouldn't be able to use arsenic? This is a very ignorant question from me, but that you wouldn't be able to use arsenic nowadays because, of course, it's not considered healthy.
We've done health and safety stuff, and I'm using really small quantities at the moment, so about the size of a coin. I'm creating blanks that size to do my experiments on, and discussing it with lab technicians, we might be able to get full protection gear and go out to Ness, actually, so it's open, and pour some arsenical coppers. Just a lot of health and safety precautions were needed.
I don't know if anyone has any comments on that that they want to add.
Yeah, I did some casting. I did use lead in the coins because obviously the composition shifts in AD 260 to lead, but it was small quantities.
Of course, there's a lot of materials, I imagine, for a lot of experimental stuff that in the past was, doesn't matter, you can pour lead on your eyeballs, but nowadays it's not really possible anymore. So it's an interesting concept to consider. We have a question for Sally. Was it possible to give an indication of how much shrinkage took place with the heat, and was there a cue of some kind to know when to stop?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because the sort of a distinct lack of clocks or timing scenarios in that sort of thing. So there was definitely shrinkage as you put the skin over the heat and you could watch it shrink. That's how quickly it was sort of moving. From the sort of ethnographic accounts by Caitlin, he talks about how the guy making the shield had his tribe with him, and they sang and danced. So I would like to see if I could find some sort of discussion and research that's been done on sort of songs for that particular procedure or for other procedures, to see if there's anything that might link with that. I was heating, I made 4 of these shields. Well, I made 3 shields and had 1 complete failed attempt. So I did it 4 times, and I heated from between 25 to 45 minutes. The one that failed was the 45-minute one, and the one that was the best was only heated for 25 minutes. And as for a cue to know when to stop, well, I've got one shield that's actually a bit smaller than the mould because I didn't stop quick enough. So it was sort of about understanding that I kept a tape measure handy and I knew how big my shield was. And if it was looking like it wasn't going to fit my mould rather, then I took it away from the heat then. Hope that answers the question. If not, give me an email and I can get back to you a bit more.
No, I think that's really interesting. It's also interesting that you mentioned there's some which were left on a bit too long and got smaller. Do you notice that that's in the archaeological record as well? There's a lot of variation in size.
Well, no, because there is only one of these particular shields.
Yes.
It's the cloth, because there's nothing to say that there aren't other artifacts made using this heat treatment process, because Indigenous Americans there's evidence of them heat treating green skin and then making bold. So there could be other artifacts made using the same way. From my perspective, the one that failed, I had to actually leave it soaking for longer than the other 3. So I wonder whether that wasn't a contribution to why it failed as well. It looked like I overcooked it. The skin became quite brittle when I tried to put it into the mould, and it sort of all cracked. So, that's quite an interesting, it's every animal's different, so every skin will therefore be different. There's so many variables, really, but you could definitely watch it shrink, and then once it was not too small for the mould, I took it out of the frame and got it set up in the mould as quickly as possible.
Okay, you mentioned cracking, by the way, because you said in your talk that the shield is still holding up well.
Yes.
But has it been used regularly since its creation? Do you think maintenance would be required if it was used more regularly?
Well, a couple of the things. One of the things I think about a lot of sort of artifact, what we view as artifacts, but obviously would have been everyday items, would have had a place somewhere within the homestead of the people that were using them. And certainly something like my shield, if it was hung up in amongst the rafters of a roundhouse, would have gradually been sort of smoked, and that would have helped its general preservation to stop it being eaten by mites or mice or anything like that sort of thing. I take it out of it's sat in my sewing room where I work, so it's sort of in the house in a dry environment. I take it out and hit it with a sword occasionally on a sort of showing students, that sort of thing, to have a look at it and see how it's going, and it's still incredibly flexible.
We have actually, I noticed, Peter, you in our chat here on our little meeting, Peter mentioned that Hephaestus, the god of blacksmithing, his lameness is a result of peripheral neuritis as a result of arsenic poisoning. Related to that, Peter, do you have a lot of students who, for example, want to do, when you're talking about health and safety, how are there any experiments that can't be done because in the modern day it's just not possible?
I'm sure there are. So the question about Hephaestus to begin with is something which I don't know where I came across that,
yes.
but it was published in 1999 in a medical journal. A suggestion that actually this might be a pattern. But as a question of whether there are experiments that can't be done, I think there probably are limits. But as far as I know, and I've only been at the Liverpool University for a year now, but as far as I know, there's been some quite exciting experiments which I sort of would have thought would be very difficult to find sort of ways to do safely, which have been managed very effectively within our labs. So I think there's exciting possibilities of all kinds, and it's the way in which they're done, the scale and so forth is the sort of the questions that need to be sort of resolved first. And obviously the safety of everyone involved is going to be the most important thing. But so far we've managed to find ways to do some very exciting experiments really, really safely. And so that's how we intend to continue.
Yes, no, thank you. No, that's good. I was more just, that was my own curiosity, I have to say. But
I mean, I tend to be quite risk averse, so I think it's certainly an interesting thing to question. But I think from a safety point of view, we've managed to find solutions to things which I think are really surprising and really sort of positive in terms of the kinds of research that we can really undertake.
Yeah. No, and I think it was there was one session yesterday where people were talking about using hemp in experiments, for example, and how there's a lot of security risks around that. And so it's interesting that there's various materials that are kind of less easy to be used, shall we say, in the modern day.
I think that's definitely true.
Yeah.
Some things require a lot more paperwork than others.
Yes, a lot more permits. Lara, yesterday someone had posted in the Discord server, I don't know if you saw it, and asked, are there political oppositions that could create a hard time for EXARC's anthropology and archaeology activities in their region? I was wondering if you had any thoughts about this. Do you think, for example, the Singapore statement is an adequate guiding document to help navigate people on these topics who might be in countries, for example, with stronger political opposition to their work?
Yes, definitely. It's a very, very good point. And that's exactly the point that I was making with the presentation, because it might be possible, that there are conflicts of interest which have political reasons, political agenda. Has it happened already? I mean, if experimental archaeologists at the end of the 19th century were conscious, as we are today, of the history of archaeology and the misuse of archaeology and the justification of power, I think maybe something different could have happened at the time. And I think that it might be possible, but again, ethical issues and research integrity and human rights, of course, need to be negotiated. So it would probably support a kind of more conscious and socially responsible research activity, together with, I don't know, for example, the promotion of democracy, for example. I'm just making one example of the many. Or applied experimental archaeology, how useful it can be to reintegrate migrating people, for example. Things like this.
Okay, we have a couple more questions still to finish us off. So for Carina and Janica, did you include any temper ingredients with your furnace shaft clay, sand or organics? Is there evidence archaeologically for this kind of modification?
No, we didn't include any things like sand or organic material into the clay. This was a modern clay, so we were not allowed to take anything like that into the clay, because then the seller, he didn't know how it would react. But Carina can answer about the prehistoric clay.
Yeah, we next to the furnaces, we found a lot of fragments from the furnace walls, and ceramic analysis show that it's coarse-grained clays that can withstand very high temperatures, but are very low in plasticity, and there are no temper added to the clays, so it's natural.
Okay, oh, that's interesting. I have another question, actually. So you used scuba divers. I noticed also a lot of nets in the video, but also using scuba divers to collect the ore from the floor of the lake. How do you think this might have been achieved in the past by, for example, hunter-gatherers or the people who were living there at the time?
Well, it's evident that you can find this ore on the depth of 1 to 3 meters or about that. So it would be possible for the people in this time to dive and get the ore without any equipment.
Okay, great. It's one way that the modern world does help us, though. It means that we can be warm while we collect it in a wetsuit. Which is...
Yes, we tried to collect some ore in May, but then it was very cold. So that's why we came back in July with scuba divers, and they were able to get much more than we could do from the boat.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, 2 more questions. We have one for Stacey. It's actually a 2-part question, although I think you mentioned one part earlier already. Were there different styles per camp, perhaps based on the exact sort of technology or the molds chosen, or did the styles vary within each camp? And the second part is, you mentioned needing more skill in future experiments, but do you think that the men who made these would have been already very skilled in this technology beforehand?
So for the first part, I do think there was actually some really interesting similarities between camps. So on the very first slide, I've got that kind of slightly chunkier badge that's got the man parachuting down with POW around him, where they've kind of designed their own badge. And I found one of those from Stelligluft 1, and then there was another one from Stelligluft 6. What I'm assuming there is probably somebody's moved between camps that was making them. So I think it's possible that it's kind of tied more to the person. And then there were other ones which tended to bear information about the camp itself. So say Stelligluft 1, Stelligluft 4. But I'm not 100% about that one. So I think it'll be interesting to look more into that and see if I can actually trace different insignia to different men who were creating them at the time, see if there was anyone that moved between specific camps at times that would tie in with that kind of creation being linked to them and traveling between camps. In terms of the skill, I had actually hypothesized that it would have to be skilled individuals doing it. So I wanted to try and learn more about that process and how complex that was going to be by undertaking that myself. As someone who had no skill in it, I thought it'd be very interesting to see if it was plausible. So actually, I think through doing this experimentation, I've realized that maybe they actually needed a bit less skill than I had thought. There was also people being sent information by the Red Cross who would send books and things like that, as well as other organizations that would support the men throughout the war. So it's very possible that they were actually sent information that would help them do it as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, so our final question is to Peter. You can finish us off. What is the status quo of experimental archaeology in the UK? Is it getting more popular? Do you think we are making progress? And what do you think the challenges are in the near future?
That's a really good question. My impression is that it's become a lot more popular over time, but I think it's something which in my view at least, is something which has become really important for us to think about, for all of us, not just as experimental archaeology, but that question about sitting at the interface between sort of research and communication, the way in which we use the opportunity for people to engage directly with archaeological research, whether that's sort of in the field in that sort of more traditional kind of experimental type of research, or whether it's research that's happened in a laboratory, which is then sort of being sort of brought, where the results are being brought to public attention. I think that those things are the things where we really still have to do quite a lot of work in bringing all of our research up into that area of interface, because I think that for me that's something which I think we don't always do as well as we could. But I mean, I think in Britain there's more and more examples of experimental centres. I mean, our own one is not by any means the first or I'm sure the last of its kind. We're just getting started really in this in Liverpool. So this is something where we're really excited about the future for sort of our department. And I think that we'll see a lot more of that kind of communicative research, if you like, as a sort of way of using the experimental results of our experiments to kind of share our knowledge a bit more effectively. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it sounds like
Really
an excellent
question.
concluding statement.
Really...
Thank you for that.